This panel is going to flow very well from, I hope, from the presentation earlier this morning, where Bob Thompson was so candid about the history of actuarial studies and actuarial information and the challenges of actuarial information used in continuing care retirement communities. So I've invited people with accounting and actuarial backgrounds to join us today. The three individuals that we have here on the left is Walt Rozett, who's past president of CALCRA. In the center is Robert Yee. He is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, and he's currently a senior consultant at Towers Watson. And then on his right is Jack Cumming, who is also a very experienced actuary, a fellow of the Society of Actuaries. And all three of these gentlemen, I think, are going to have interesting perspectives. What's somewhat unusual is we've invited Mr. Yee to join us, and he is not directly involved in industry. He is an actuary that's worked a great deal in long-term care insurance. And many of the financing issues for long-term care insurance are similar to the financing issues for CCRCs. Okay, very good. Jack is going to circulate a handout. And particularly Mr. Yee testified about the Class Act, which was part of the Affordable Care Act, and the component of that was intended to create a long-term care insurance policy that was sort of going to be a national policy, and testified that actuarially it was not sound. And so we have somebody who's looked at these issues from another perspective in long-term care. So, did you decide if you want to use the podium, or do you want to? Okay, great. We'll start with the podium, and we start off with Walt Rozett.
Okay, I am a resident of University Retirement Community at Davis and have been for some 13 years now. Catherine mentioned that I'm a former president, but I've been promoted to vice president of CALCRA at the present time. I'm also a member of the Continuing Care Resident Advisory Committee that recently has been formed by the Continuing Care Contracts Branch. And that is a result of splitting up the Continuing Care Advisory Committee, which consisted of both residents and providers, and now there are separate provider and resident organizations. In my working career, I was chief financial officer of several Fortune 500 companies in California. Recognizing the title of this panel, I'd like to start off with a definition of financing. And basically, it is the science of the management of money, other assets, and the credit needed to start and keep a CCRC or other operation in business. And since we'll be talking about reserves, I'd like to make a few comments on them because I think that reserves are very complicated things to understand. They are basically amounts set aside for a particular purpose. There are funded reserves and non-funded reserves. Funded reserves require that cash or approved investments be set aside solely to meet the purpose of the reserve. They're shown on the balance sheet as an asset. Non-funded reserves include the reserve for depreciation, that is an accumulation of depreciation of assets that are reduced in values as they are used or as time passes. A reserve for bad debts or doubtful accounts is similar. These would be more appropriately called accumulated depreciation and allowance for bad debts, since their purpose is simply to reduce the value of the assets on the balance sheet to a proper level. An actuarial reserve, that we'll obviously be talking a little bit more about, is a liability equal to the present value of future expenditures, such as for the medical care of CCRC residents. actuarial reserves would be shown on the balance sheet as a liability. There are the non-funded reserves, and they're part of the excess of assets over liabilities, or the net worth of a CCRC. So they're not shown separately on the balance sheet. And this would include amounts set aside for future expenditures, like the renovation of a building. More important is the contingency reserve to provide for unexpected expenses. For a nonprofit CCRC, that is the primary purpose of having an excess of assets over liabilities. The Resident Advisory Committee recently wrote to the Deputy Director of the Department of Social Services indicating that more effective reporting and monitoring of CCRC financing is needed. Emphasis is currently, as you heard Bob Thompson say a little bit earlier, is currently on annual reports and on funded short-term reserves for debt service and operating expenses. The focus on oversight and enforcement, however, needs to cover the provider's long-term financial viability, including minimum net worth and the adequacy of reserves to provide for future services to residents. We're effectively asking that more attention be concentrated on the future rather than the past. There are a number of matters in the letter beyond monitoring financing, covering the need for changes in the law, improvement of regulatory oversight and transparency, but I won't discuss them today. A few years ago, CALCRA sponsored legislation that is now covered by Section 1790 of the Health and Safety Code, requiring that providers report full details of all reserves, including amounts maintained for contingencies. Currently, about 20% of the CCRCs in California have a negative net worth. Therefore, they have no contingency reserve to deal with problems such as a fire, an earthquake, or economic downturn that may impact the need for future financing. The Continuing Care Contracts branch has done little or nothing to specify the new reserve reporting, to specify the minimum requirements, or to analyze the information submitted. The branch simply does not have the resources to monitor the long-term financial viability of CCRCs. We at CALCRA believe that the preferable solution is to transfer the financial oversight, not the other oversight, but rather just the financial side of it, to the Department of Insurance, because there is a substantial amount of insurance involved in the promises made under CCRC contracts. Beyond that, the approach in insurance oversight concentrates on managing the future. There are many reasons for the financial oversight of CCRCs to be concerned with the future. The past cannot be changed. It is what it is. But you can change the future. What is needed is a set of financial standards that bring financial problems into focus as early as possible. A requirement for the submission of corrective action plans when those standards are not met. An adequate oversight to ensure that the action plans are implemented as quickly as possible. Properly developed, this can be accomplished in a manner that makes it reasonably self-enforcing. What lies ahead is governed by many factors beyond the control of providers. They need to be adequately prepared to deal with whatever may have an impact on CCRC financing. There are things like the federal debt is about $16 trillion and increasing each year. There's a shortfall of about $80 trillion in the funding of Social Security and Medicare. The U.S. may well be headed towards the financial problems that you currently see in Japan and Europe. Interest rates, inflation, and unemployment may well be headed towards double digits. There are some positive signs when you look down the road, however. The U.S. now has the largest supply of energy in the world. By the year 2020, we should be a net exporter of energy. Technology is developing rapidly. 3D printing may well bring a lot of manufacturing back to the United States. It may not create a lot of jobs, but it should have a significant improvement on the economy. Developments in biotechnology and medical care will increase life expectancy significantly. I read recently that the first person to live to be 150 years old has already been born. Obviously, all of these developments will have a significant impact on CCRCs. Looking at the changes that lie down the road emphasizes the need for sound financial planning by every CCRC provider and the need for effective oversight by the state of California. That is fundamentally my message for the day.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, I think Bob Yee will talk about this.
Well, Walt, I think you said it all. I don't know what to add to this. Again, as Catherine mentioned, I'm not a CCRC expert. As my profession is an actuary, but I do have a lot of experience over 35 years on looking at insurance financial systems. And based on what I've tried to Google this past week, I think CCRC are in trouble, I think. And you all know that, so I'm not going to say more about that. But just let me give you more of a outsider perspective and from more of a 30,000 feet rather than a very detailed level, why I think that way. First of all, in California, somebody mentioned there's only 20,000 of you. I think it's a little bit more than that. There are over 100 CCRCs. But still, in terms of number, you have a very small size, in any measure. Just give you some example, there are 13,000 long-term care nursing facilities with about 300,000 residents. There are, I don't know the exact number of residents in residential care facility and assisted living facilities, but there are over 200,000 beds with even 80% occupancy. That's add another 160,000. So it's close to 500,000 of people needing care that are using some sort of long-term care. So compared to 20-some-odd thousand, that just, people are not going to pay too much attention to it, unfortunately. Although the challenge is real. The challenge is real. And, part of it is because, as Walt and everybody recognize, this is an insurance contract, really. Somebody made a promise to you, and with the tension now is the delivery of that promise. The promise to you may be, in one way or misunderstood or whatever, but that nevertheless, that's the reality. The reality is that it's a very complex promise somebody made, and the pricing of it is very, very sketchy. Not a lot. I don't think a lot of research have done into really how much the whole package costs, and that's why you're seeing these increase in monthly fees, and simply because the expectation in the pricings are not being realized. Things have changed. Obviously, events are changing. The providers are giving you some sort of promise based on uncertainty, of uncertainties in events in the future that they have they have a little bit control over, but not quite a bit of control over, like people living longer and need more care and so forth. So this is an insurance contract, and just want to make sure that we realize how complex this pricing and management of it is. There are lots of moving parts and variables. I'm just going to mention some. And the biggest one is utilization of care. It's when do people really need certain level of care, for how long, what's the intensity. Then you get into the population issues about how many new entrants you could attract, and what and what fee and so forth you're going to charge them, and then the mortality rates and people getting out of the rate of people withdrawing or moving out of CCRC, and then the refund fees and so forth. It's very complex, more and more so because of the various different products being offered. And then you got the physical structures, the maintenance, the remodeling and so forth. And then, when clearly there's some funds being, maintained, then the investment return of that fund, the indebtedness associated with the buildings, operating expenses, and you put it all together, it's a very complex business. That's why I see it, like in a week or so. And believe me, insurance products are generally a lot more simpler than that. An insurance company have trouble dealing with it, as you know. Long-term care insurance going through a tough time. Insurance company are pulling out, and it's a much simpler product than a CCRC product. Then we get to, what we have talked, and hopefully we talk a little bit about, what's an actuarial study and what does it do, that kind of thing. And just for the people who don't really understand what it is, I'll just spend a minute talk about that. It's really more than a budgeting tool. It's not a, it's more than simply an accounting entry. I think in the accounting world, how you're accounting to a snapshot, financial snapshot of CCRCs, there's something called a future service obligation, which is more of a termination or bankruptcy type of accounting. That doesn't really half reflect the total liabilities or the risk inherent in the CCRC business. And what the actuarial study is simply it's really two parts. The way I see it. One is because you set up a price and you have certain expectation and assumption you make when you set up the price. An actuarial study really is to go and look at the experience and the costs running it in the future, and that you're experiencing, and say, well, how well it matches up? So is the pricing, the original pricing, correct? So that's the part of it, is to make sure, okay, and the useful thing about this is that when I set up prices for new residents, then I can deal with it, make adjustment to it. And the second thing to do is to figure out, is the fund that you have sufficient to, and together with together with the future fees and the investment return, to cover the future benefits and expenses. And that's really the only thing people should care about, is that do you have enough fund today to cover future liabilities? And you got to look at it from the current residents' perspective and also from new potential residents' perspective. So those two items in an actuarial study give you a lot of information about, and it's not easy to do because, as you know, you're predicting the future. So there are a lot of uncertainty going around there. But the actually also learn how to do is that they do what if scenarios. What if my cost goes up instead of 5% a year, 10% a year? What does it do to the fund if I don't have enough fund to do that? So what we've done is that playing some sensitivity analysis, you could tell how well an organization are able to cushion some of these unexpected future events. So that's really what an actuarial study would do. And 5 years way too long. I would recommend at least once or even every other year. If you don't do that, because things change so rapidly, you have to do that. And I know there's an issue about confidentiality and so forth, but insurance companies deal with this for hundreds of years, and it works out. It works very well for them. So it could work here in California also. So I mean that's what I'm going to say. Now one thing I'd like to point out is that I don't know, I think it does take new legislation. My review of the current California code is that I just don't think there's enough thing you could do, or any department, even Department of Insurance could do anything about it to resolve the problem. And in the absence of legislation, perhaps I just want to point out is that the Financial Accounting Standard Board are looking into new way of accounting for all businesses, including CCRC, mostly for profit, but it would probably eventually hit nonprofit. And hopefully, the way they want to do it is to have more transparency And some of the issues and some of these things that are hidden in the absence of an actuarial study might actually surface, but that might take 5 years or so forth. So there's a ray of hope, even though there's no legislation, that there will be more transparency in the financial reporting of CCRC in the future. Thank you.
Well, they have a notice up here that says, keep the microphone 12 inches away, so let me know if I'm not doing it right. I'm the fellow asked to catch an airplane, so I'm going to have to talk rather quickly, and I apologize for that, but I want to thank Catherine Pearson and the George School for making this possible today. And for those in the audience, I've given you a handout with some work that NACRA, the National Continuing Care Residents Association, has been working on. For those of you who may be in the remote audience, in the internet audience, you can find this same material at www.naccrau, that's NACCRAU.com. If you look under the topics for learning, click on CCRC Living, you'll find a topic called Standards and Model Laws. And I handed out some material on that, which relates to something that Bob Thompson was talking about this morning. But before I say that, I want to say a positive word about continuing care retirement communities and continuing care contracts and the entire idea of allowing people to provide responsibly for their own aging. And that's the continuing care concept. The continuing care retirement community, when it has a full inclusive care contract, is the ideal. It's a comprehensive solution to the problems of aging. Maybe it should have the medical care piece included too, but in our society that's a little hard to accomplish. But this model is in place, and it's something that if we give a little thought to it, we may be able to replicate in some way to address the long-term care problem, which is a major national problem. You know, we have a commission. They had the Class Act a couple of years ago, and finally, after a lot of study, and it was actually enacted, wishful thinking, it failed because it wasn't actuarially sound. And you've heard Bob Yee talk, and he's an actuary, and he talks intelligently, but basically, actuarial work is mathematical. We model things to see if they're workable or not. And the Class Act was simply found not to be workable. So they wanted to form a new commission to address that. And the Senate appointed 6 people, and the House appointed 6 people. The White House appointed 3 people. They haven't done it yet. Well, since it failed on actuarial grounds, I asked recently one of the senior national people, how many actuaries are, of the 12 people who have been appointed so far to this committee, how many are actuaries? 0. So we may not be the most interesting people. And Bob Thompson may not think that our work is that reliable, but I want to assure him that it can be reliable. Now, NACRA has been involved. NACRA is that national association, which is different from CALCRA. CALCRA is not a member of national. The national organization has welcomed providers, and I think CALCRA has trouble with the fact that we work very closely with providers and have provider members. And in fact, in California, when CALCRA withdrew from NACRA, Leading Age of California became, they wanted the residents of California to still have involvement in the National Association. So they created a channel for the residents of California to still be involved in NACRA. So when I'm talking about NACRA, that's not the same as CALCRA exactly. Although we're very hopeful that CALCRA will rejoin us at some point. We welcome them, we want their input. But anyway, we've been in a process to determine what resident concerns and needs are. And not surprisingly, perhaps, those concerns focus on contract clarity and financial integrity. Residents don't fully understand the contracts that they sign. I did a talk on Tuesday in Oakland, And I asked the audience, there may have been 100 people there, how many of you understood your contract when you signed it? Not one hand went up in that room. So they signed this thing. They didn't understand what it was. But we tested our thinking last April, so a year ago, in a focus group in Virginia. And one of the things that was surprising to me was that the top resident concern, they were concerned about all sorts of things, like costs are going up, and will I be able to afford it? Will I outlive my assets? Healthcare costs are going up. Will that take away the money I would have used to pay for this? But their biggest concern was the shift of risk from providers to residents, the move from inclusive contracts to fee-for-service contracts, or the type B hybrid, which is somewhere in between. They moved into a CCRC buying the promise that they were going to be cared for, that this was going to allow them to not be a burden on their children or on society. They weren't going to be wards of the state. And all of a sudden they got in there and found, well, gee, the provider was uncomfortable taking the risk, so they put it on us. Well, we're just little people, they're big providers. They're sophisticated. If they can't understand the risk well enough to manage it, how do they expect us to? But anyway, that was the top concern. And so we also saw parallels, and maybe this is me because I'm an actuary and I've worked in the insurance industry, and I see tremendous parallels between the CCRC industry and the life insurance industry. And if you go back in life insurance history, you'll discover the marvelous thing of the Armstrong investigation in 1905, with wonderful people like Charles Evans Hughes as the chief counsel to the committee that did the inquiry and brought the life insurance executives up, because the life insurance executives were spending the reserves on a lavish lifestyle. Henry Baldwin Hyde rode to the Equitable in a coach and four, rolled out a red carpet, and every day so that he wouldn't get his feet sullied walking into the Equitable offices. And so that led to comprehensive regulation of the life insurance industry at the state level, which has made the life insurance industry functional ever since. The CCRC industry today is about where the life insurance industry was in the 1870s. And there are other industries. I mean, you've seen what's happened with the cruise industry, which has managed to avoid regulation because they carry some kind of a flag. But the Government Accountability Office, I think at the request of the Senate Committee on Aging, did a study of CCRCs, and they raised the question, secure retirement or risky investment? And I think the very title says, well, gee, there must be something risky about this. And they concluded that there was a need for legislation to do something about it, but they thought it ought not to be at the federal level. They wanted it at the state level. And at the state level, excuse me, I've got a runny nose here. At the state level, for the insurance industry, the states pool their resources, because no state has sufficient resources, in the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. So you might have expected that the NAIC would help develop codes for CCRCs, but they've got their hands full right now, as somebody mentioned before, with the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act of 2010, so they don't have time to do this. So the admonishing from the Cole Commission that maybe some kind of state regulation was needed, they couldn't take it up. So we in NACRA decided to do that, and if you go to the website that I mentioned to you, you can find exposure drafts of laws in different areas that address many of these things. For example, Bob Thompson mentioned that when they tried to get actuarial reports in California, sometimes the actuaries played with the assumptions to please their clients. They were venal, I guess, or they were unprofessional, or something of that sort. Well, in the life insurance industry, they solved that by having standard valuation requirements, which applied for a long, long time. So we put together a law model, and most of these laws, these are not original laws. We've just taken the insurance precedents and adapted them to the CCRC industry, and I think you'll find that they would work. But anyway, let's talk quickly about what they do. And I'm watching the clock here because I've got to run. But let's start with contracts. And Bob mentioned that there aren't a whole lot of rules on contracts. And I want to share with you an actual sentence from a contract that a resident has been required to sign within the last month. And one of the things that I tried to do, because I think these are industry-wide problems, I try to avoid using my own provider organization because I don't want to embarrass them just because they have the misfortune that I'm a resident there. So I'm blessed that my sister, who you don't know, is moving into a continuing care retirement community. I think Bob knows because Bob and I had a conversation about this. But anyway, here's an actual sentence that she was required to sign. I understand and agree that at any time and from time to time, all without notice to me and without affecting your rights or my obligations hereunder, you may alter any terms of the residence agreement or any part of it, including renewing, compromising, extending, or accelerating, or otherwise changing the time for payment of amounts due thereunder. That's an actual contract in the state of California. And there's nothing contrary to statute in that contract. So the continuing care contracts branch would have no basis for saying that was an improper contract. They would have to approve it if it's submitted for approval. So my sister and her attorney went over with her to the provider and said, I can't advise my client to sign this contract because it's so one-sided. And the provider said, well, it's approved by the state of California. We're not allowed to change one word in it. You have to sign it as it is. And my sister's sold on living there, and she feels she needs that kind of support. So she signed it. And that's what people in this demographic do. They're not protected. They're signing a contract like this, and that's considered acceptable. So we have a law that would begin to address that. It's exposed. We hope to get input. We don't want to have unintended consequences. We want to get as much feedback as we can. Now, the second thing is bankruptcy risk. Insurance policyholders are shielded from loss in the event the insurance company goes bankrupt. So if you buy a $10,000 life insurance policy goes bankrupt, you're going to get your money. You don't have to be alarmed. CCRC residents who frequently sell their residence to buy in and trade ownership for some kind of a license to inhabit a community have no protection. They're general creditors in the event of bankruptcy. Now people say, well, gee, no residents ever lost money. Well, the people at Cumming in South Hills, they lost money. People say, well, usually it's the bondholders who take the hit. The bondholders are senior in the indentures or in the whole process in the bankruptcy proceeding to the CCRC residents. It's only with sufferance that they're protected. We have a proposal modeled on the insurance precedent, well tested, it's worked for years to address that. Third is the matter of believable promises. Today's, Walt mentioned, or maybe Bob Yeast, FASB's looking at things, but the AICPA, which develops guidelines, and the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which promulgates the standards which govern American GAAP, have singled out the CCRC industries for special treatment. So an entrance fee contract, if you were to say, well, we're going to use your entrance fee to pay a level portion of your rent, so it would be identical to a single premium annuity. But the accounting is not consistent with the accounting that would apply to a single premium annuity. But consistency is one of the fundamental principles of accounting, but it doesn't apply here. A second principle is that you recognize revenue in an accounting context when the promise that that revenue is intended to fund is fulfilled. So now somebody's paying an entrance fee to have a lifetime of service. You should only recognize that revenue as those services are provided ratably over the course of the term. That would require an actuarial calculation. They don't want to do that. They simplified it. They use a life expectancy standard, but the life expectancy standard front ends the earnings. So it looks like the CCRC is doing better in the early years, and then later when the services come due, the money's not there to pay them, so they have to increase the rates to make it up. So we need something to bring rationality to the way the finances are handled. Now, I have another thing that I just want to touch on, and that is basically when you're asking people to sell your house, to invest in a contract, you want to make sure that it's not blue sky. And every state has blue sky laws to prevent invalid investments. And we have the SEC, which has developed standards to prevent invalid investments. So I'm not sure why continuing care contracts aren't held to that same standard. The passive bondholders in a CCRC get a more valid, a more elaborate disclosure document in the form of a prospectus than a resident gets. The resident gets a marketing pitch, and it includes how delightful the meals are, and they are good. And I'm very happy with where I live, but that's not the same as making people aware of what they're investing their life savings in. They imagine they're going to avoid being wards of the state for the rest of their lives. That doesn't always work out. So, like the comprehensive legislation that emerged from the 1905 Armstrong investigation, we've now put together the beginning of a comprehensive program to try to bring the same kind of rationality to the CCRC industry that would make this product as reliable and trustworthy as what people have come to expect from life and annuity insurance companies. We don't have it now. Excuse me. So to my provider friends who tend to feel that they are the victims of excessive regulation, and I think you probably are in the area of the health and safety rules. I hear some of the requirements from OSHPD and the rest of it that seem highly reactive to me and hardly proactive. So there is a tremendous burden, but that doesn't carry over into the area of contracts and finance. So to my provider friends who would prefer that we just trust them to do what's best, I suggest that it can be less traumatic to embrace standards than to try to defend the alternative. And we've just seen with this Rogue Valley Manor case that the alternative is an unpleasant one. We don't want to go there. We'd rather work with you. NACWA's trying to work with you, so we hope you'll do it. The continuing care model is the right approach to the challenges of an aging population. We need to nurture and extend it, and that's going to require us all to work together. Thank you all, and I'm going to run to my phone.
Inevitably, interest rates are going to go up. When that happens, how will the industry respond? A, raising the monthly care fee even higher, or lowering the standard of service?
Well, let me start off by saying that monthly care fees are influenced primarily by what the market will bear. You can't...
And let me just interrupt for a moment and repeat the question. The question was, what will happen when interest rates go up? How will that be affected? How will that be reflected by the contract or the payment practices and collection practices of the CCRCs?
Okay, my starting point is that monthly fees and entry fees are essentially set by what the market will bear. If you keep raising entry fees at the rate of 10% a year, your occupancy rate will very shortly be down to enough to have the place closed. So there are some limitations. We do have several CCRCs with low occupancy rates right now where the residents and the provider are working together to actually cut services and to do it in a way that's the residents feel as if they are making the decision as well as the providers. I don't think that the eventual rise in interest rates is going to necessarily have a significant impact on any provider, presuming that they have long-term fixed rate financing in effect right now. If they don't have it in effect right now, and 5 years from now they're trying to get a loan, the interest rate may well be 10 to 15%. That's poor financial management. And you simply have to get the provider to understand that long-term financing, if needed, needs to be in place right now.
Thank you very much, both of you.